The great hall throbbed with the scent of pine resin, roasting meat, and the sharp, ferrous tang of anxious blood. Esme Shadowmoon watched the floor, her knuckles white where they gripped the rough-hewn bench. She was the last, the unchosen. A smudge of shadow in a room ablaze with triumphant pairings. The elder was about to strike the ceremonial gong, branding her unclaimed for another cycle. The air grew still. A shadow fell across her, smelling of snow and cold iron. A voice, low and rough as granite, vibrated beside her ear. "Act like you're mine." The command was not a whisper. It was a weight. Esme's breath hitched, caught in her throat. She dared not look up. The ceremony's rules were absolute. Once the pairings were set, no one moved until the elder's final blessing. But this was not part of the ceremony. The body beside her was a furnace, a wall of fur and heat that blocked out the rest of the hall. The scent of him, frost, pine, and something ancient and metallic like a buried sword, was overwhelming. The entire hall, once a roar of feasting and laughter, had fallen into a silence so profound she could hear the drip of melting ice from the rafters. "Look at me," the voice commanded. It was not loud, but it cut through the silence, and Esme's spine locked. Slowly, as if pulling her head from frozen mud, she lifted her gaze. It was not one of her pack. This was not Alaric, the pack alpha, whose gaze of pitying contempt she knew so well. This man was a stranger, a giant. He was built of mountain rock and winter shadow. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, long and tied back with a leather thong, revealing the harsh, beautiful angles of his face. His eyes were not the warm amber of her people. They were a piercing, glacial gold, pupils slitted like a wolf's in the half-light. He was Gideon Bloodclaw, the alpha king of the northern clans, a man who was more myth than flesh, a ruler who had not left his frozen stronghold in a decade. And he was looking at her, not with pity or contempt or even desire. He was looking at her as if she were a tool he had just picked up. He'd said, "Act like you're mine." It was a command, a strategy. She was a piece on a board she didn't understand. Her mind, quick and fearful, raced. To be unclaimed was to be shunned. To be claimed even in this bizarre, terrifying pantomime was... what? The local alpha, Alaric, finally found his voice. It was a strained, angry growl. "High King," he said, stepping forward, his own broad shoulders tense. "The ceremony is concluded. This is not right. She is our pack." Gideon Bloodclaw did not turn. His golden gaze remained locked on Esme, a palpable pressure. "She sat alone," he stated. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the bench, into Esme's very bones. "The law of the great hunt is clear. Any unchosen at the moon's zenith is forfeit, or claimed." He paused, the silence stretching. "The local alpha may not want her, but the crown will have her." A collective gasp swept the hall. He hadn't just claimed her for the night. He had claimed her by royal decree. Gideon rose, a fluid, terrifying movement. He didn't just stand. He loomed, a colossus of black fur and leather. He looked down at Esme, who was still frozen, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. He offered her his hand. It was not a request. It was an expectation. His hand was massive, scarred across the knuckles, the nails dark and sharp. Esme looked at that hand, then at the faces of her pack. She saw the shock, the jealousy, the sudden sharp fear in Alaric's eyes. They had pitied her. They had ignored her. They had deemed her worthless, the last of a weak-forgotten bloodline. And now, the most powerful wolf on the continent, a king of legend and terror, had singled her out. Her hand was trembling so violently she could barely control it. She was small, pale, a creature of shadow and herbs, her Shadowmoon name a mockery of a power she didn't possess. He was the Bloodclaw, a name earned in the snow forges of war. She placed her cold, trembling fingers into his hot, calloused palm. His grip was immediate, firm, and inescapable. He did not pull her up gently. He simply drew her to her feet, tucking her against his side as if she were a shield he was strapping on. The heat of him scorched her through her thin wool dress. "She is with me," Gideon announced to the stunned hall. His voice was final, a gavel strike of absolute law. He began to walk, pulling her with him. Esme stumbled, her feet numb, her head swimming. They walked out of the great hall, away from the feast, away from the only life she had ever known. The silence that followed them was louder than any jeer. She was alone, and then, in a single heartbeat, she was his. She didn't know which was worse. The chambers Gideon Bloodclaw was given were the best in the timber-framed fortress, the Lord's Suite, meant for visiting alphas, with a stone fireplace large enough to roast a boar. He did not release her hand until the heavy oak door was shut. The iron bolt dropped with a thud that echoed Esme's sudden trapped heartbeat. She immediately scuttled backward, her shoulders hitting the cold, rough-hewn stone of the wall. She was a mouse, and the lion had just sealed the den. Gideon did not look at her. He moved to the fireplace, his heavy fur cloak shedding bits of frost and pine needles onto the floor. He was immense. The room, so large moments before, seemed to shrink around him. He grabbed the iron poker and stabbed at the dying embers, sending a volcano of orange sparks into the chimney. The fire roared back to life, painting the planes of his harsh face in flickering red and gold. He was a creature of fire and ice, and she was nothing. Why? The word escaped her, a breathless, terrified squeak. Gideon Bloodclaw stilled. He kept his back to her, a solid wall of black leather and muscle. For a long time, he just stared into the flames. "Your alpha is weak," he said, his voice a low growl. "He lets his pack starve while he hoards the best of the hunt. He lets his strong mock the weak. A pack is a body. A weak limb invites infection." Esme's brow furrowed. What did that have to do with her? I don't understand." He finally turned. The firelight caught the chilling intelligence in his golden eyes. "You were the infection, girl. The limb he was letting fester. To be unclaimed, in his pack, is a death sentence. Another moon, and they would have left you in the snow for the other wolves to find." A cold dread, deeper than her fear of him, seeped into her bones. She knew he was right. Alaric's pity was a thin veneer over his impatience. She was a mouth to feed, a remnant of a failed line. So you saved me?" she whispered, though the word felt wrong. This didn't feel like salvation. It felt like being moved from one cage to another, this one with much larger bars. "I used you," he corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "The royal visitation has rules. The king cannot interfere in local pack law unless that law is broken in his presence." He moved to the table, pouring himself a cup of dark, steaming liquid from a pitcher. The scent of mulled wine and spices filled the air. Alaric broke the law. He failed to provide for all his pack. He allowed the unclaimed to be dishonored. By the ancient law, the unclaimed becomes the property and the responsibility of the crown. He drank, his throat working. Esme watched, mesmerized by the sheer contained power of him. "You are my responsibility," he said, setting the cup down. He looked at her, and his gaze was heavy, assessing. "A burden I did not ask for, but one I am now bound to." The humiliation of it, the cold, transactional nature of her rescue, stung more than a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile defense. What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. A strange, dark flicker of something, amusement, pity, she couldn't tell, passed over his features. "From you? Nothing." He unclasped the heavy bear pelt cloak from his shoulders. It fell to the floor with a heavy thump. "You will have a warm bed, you will have food, you will be silent. In 3 days we ride for the Iron Keep. My lands." He gestured to a small adjoining room, a simple cot visible in the gloom. "That is yours." Then he turned back to the fire. He began to unstrap the leather vambraces from his arms. The movement pulled his tunic taut, outlining the brutal cording of his muscles. Esme's eyes widened. Dark, wet blood stained the linen beneath the leather. He was wounded. He must have felt her stare. He paused, his hand at his side. "My quarters," he growled, a clear dismissal. Esme fled. She ducked into the small, cold alcove and pulled the heavy curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sank onto the cot, her body shaking. She sat in the darkness, listening. She heard the scrape of leather, a hissed breath of pain, and then silence. She expected the sound of him crossing to the main bed. She expected the creak of the mattress. Instead, after a long, drawn-out stillness, she heard a different sound, a heavy, measured thump, and then another. He was not in the bed. Risking everything, she pulled the curtain back a fraction of an inch. The fire was burning low, and there, on the hearth, sleeping on the cold stone floor between her and the bolted door, was a wolf. It was colossal. Its fur was the color of a moonless night, its head resting on its massive paws. It was him. He had shifted. He was sleeping as a wolf, a monstrous, silent guardian. He hadn't taken the bed. He had taken the floor. He wasn't locking her in. He was locking the world out, and he was blocking her escape. Esme pulled the curtain shut, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was trapped, not with a man, but with a beast. A wounded, powerful, and utterly unreadable beast. Dawn came not with light, but with a shifting of the cold. Esme woke with a gasp, the rough wool blanket clutched to her chin. She'd fallen asleep curled in a tight ball, her body rigid with fear. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar stone walls confusing her. Then she heard it, the low, steady breathing of a large animal. She peeked through the curtain. The fire was a bed of pale, silvery ash. The massive black wolf was gone. In his place, Gideon Bloodclaw sat on the stone hearth, his back to her. He was already dressed in his black leathers, his hair damp as if he'd just come from the snow. He was tending to his wound. The linen bandage wrapped around his left forearm was soaked through with a dark, sluggish fluid that didn't look like blood. It was black, iridescent, like raven oil. He unwrapped it with a steady hand, revealing a gash that was jagged, inflamed, and unnervingly dark. It looked poisoned. He seemed to sense her watching. His shoulders tensed. "There is water in the pitcher," he said, his voice rough from sleep, "and bread on the table. We leave in an hour." Esme crept out, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She kept her eyes down, moving to the small table. Her stomach growled, betraying her. She hadn't eaten at the feast. She tore off a piece of the dense, dark bread, her hands still shaking. A furious pounding echoed through the room as someone hammered on the chamber door. "King Gideon!" It was Alaric's voice, tight with rage. "You cannot do this! You defy our laws! You shame my pack!" Gideon rose slowly, refastening his vambrace over the fresh but already darkening bandage. He moved to the door, not to the peephole, but to the center. He did not unbolt it. "I am the law, Alaric." Gideon's voice was a low vibration, and the very door seemed to shake with it. "She is a curse, a bad luck charm. The Shadow Moon line is barren and weak. You take her, you take the rot with her." Alaric yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. Esme flinched, the bread turning to ash in her mouth. She backed away, pressing herself into the shadows of the corner. "You had your chance to honor the weak," Gideon said, his voice dangerously soft. "You chose to let her rot, so now the rot is mine to manage." He paused. "Open your gates. My men are gathering the tithe. We ride north before the next snow." "Tithe? You cannot. Our larders are half empty." "Your larders are full," Gideon stated. "My men found your hidden cache behind the smokehouse, the one you kept from your own pack." A choked, strangled sound of fury came from the other side of the door. You will not leave this valley alive, King." Gideon actually smiled. It was a terrible sight, a baring of teeth that held no warmth at all. "My men are the Bloodclaws, pup. We were born in the valley you will die in. Now, open your gates, or I will." The footsteps retreated, heavy and fast, laced with the sound of muttered curses. Silence descended once more, heavy and complete. Gideon turned from the door. He looked at Esme, huddled in the corner like a pile of rags. His expression was impossible to read. It was harsh, carved from stone, but his golden eyes seemed to track the tremor in her hands. He moved to the table, grabbed a link of dried sausages, and tossed them, along with a waterskin, into a leather satchel. "You saw the wound," he stated. It wasn't a question. Esme nodded, unable to speak. "It is a curse," he said flatly, as if discussing the weather. "From a shadow witch in the southern fens. It does not heal." It looks poisoned," Esme whispered, finding her voice. It was thin, but it was there. "It is." "I know herbs," she offered before she could stop herself. Her mother had taught her. The Shadow Moons weren't weak, they were healers. But Alaric's pack only valued strength of arm, not of root. Gideon's eyes narrowed. He took a single step toward her, and she had to fight the urge to bolt. He stopped, just out of arm's reach. He studied her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Herbs will not work," he said. They might, she insisted, a flicker of her old self, the girl who roamed the woods stirring. The poison, it needs a counter, something to draw it out, night moss and silver thistle. He watched her, his head tilted slightly, like a wolf listening for a sound only it can hear. He seemed to be weighing something. Then he shook his head. A minute, sharp movement. No, we ride. He threw a heavy fur-lined cloak at her. It was his, the one from the floor, and it smelled of him. Pine, frost, and the faint coppery tang of his cursed blood. It was so heavy she staggered as she caught it. You will ride with me. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not slow us down. He pulled the door bolt back. The shriek of the iron was a death knell. He was taking her from her home. He was a cursed king, leading a hostile pack, and she was his prisoner, his burden. He paused in the open doorway, the gray, snowy light of the morning silhouetting his massive frame. He looked back at her, his face in shadow. "You are a shadow moon," he said, his voice low. "My grandmother used to say that name meant something." He turned and strode out, leaving her to follow in his enormous, terrifying wake. The journey was a blur of gray-white misery. The wind was a living thing, a shrieking entity that tore at Esme's face and stole the breath from her lungs. She was mounted on a shaggy northern pony, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth tied to the saddle horn. Not out of malice, Gideon had explained in his flat, cold tone, but because if she fell, the blizzard would claim her in seconds. He would not be able to find her. Gideon himself rode ahead, not on a horse, but on a colossal war-bred moose, its antlers a fortress of bone. He broke the trail, a black figure against the howling white, his blood-claw warriors, a dozen silent fur-clad wraiths flanking them. They were not traveling through a forest, they were moving through a frozen skeletal world. The trees were claws of black ice. The snow was waist-deep, a powdery, suffocating ocean. Esme's world shrank to the thump of her own heart, the labored breathing of her pony, and the broad, unmoving back of the king. He had not spoken to her since they left the fortress. He was a machine, set on one purpose, moving forward. On the second day, the wind died, and the silence that fell was worse. It was a heavy, watchful silence. The snow-laden branches of the pines muffled every sound. Esme's pony snorted, its breath a plume of steam, and the noise was shockingly loud. Gideon reined in his mount, his hand raised. The entire column stopped. Esme listened. There was nothing, just the ringing in her ears. Gideon's head turned, slowly. He was scanning the ridge above them, a high, dark line of rock and pine. "What is it?" one of his warriors murmured, his hand moving to the hilt of his axe. "Shadows," Gideon whispered. His voice was a bare breath of sound, but it carried in the still air. And then Esme saw them. At first she thought it was just the wind moving the snow on the ridge, but the shapes were too solid, too deliberate. They were thin, spindly creatures, fashioned from the darkness between the trees. They had no features, just vague, man-like shapes with claws that seemed to drip darkness, the Shadow Witch's curse. The blood claws formed a tight circle around Esme, their axes and swords drawn, their faces grim. They were not afraid, but they were wary. "They cannot be killed," Gideon's second-in-command, a scarred man named Kyle, growled. "They only feed." "They feed on the curse," Gideon said, his own massive blade sliding from its sheath with a sound like ice cracking. "They smell me." The creatures, a dozen of them, flowed down the ridge like ink spilling on white paper. They made no sound. "Stay with the girl," Gideon ordered Kale. "My king, no!" But Gideon was already moving. He spurred his mount forward, a black avalanche of man and beast, and charged directly at the shadow line. He roared, and it was not a human sound. It was the sound of rockfall, of an iceberg calving, a pure primal blast of alpha dominance. The shadows hesitated, their forms wavering. Gideon's blade, when it struck, did not cut. It burned. The steel was etched with glowing runes, and when it hit the first shadow, the creature ignited, dissolving into a cloud of oily black smoke, shrieking a sound that vibrated in Esme's teeth. But there were too many. They flowed around him, ignoring his warriors, their focus entirely on the king. They swarmed his mount, their dark claws raking. The moose bellowed in pain and terror. "The king!" Kale roared, breaking formation. It was a mistake. The moment he moved, one of the shadows detached from the main group. It was impossibly fast. It didn't run. It simply appeared beside Esme's pony. Esme screamed. The creature's touch was not physical. It was a profound, soul-deep cold. It reached for her, its claws of shadow aimed at her heart. She would not die. Not like this. A black-furred missile hit the creature, exploding in a snarl of pure rage. Gideon. He had shifted. He was on his feet, his moose gone, and he was in his wolf form. He was magnificent. He was a monster, larger than any wolf had a right to be, a dire wolf of legend. His jaws clamped down on the shadow creature, his teeth glowing with the same runic power as his sword. The creature dissolved, but the others were on him. They raked his flanks, their shadowy claws sinking deep. He roared in pain, a sound that was half howl, half scream. He threw them off, a whirlwind of black fur and snapping teeth, and then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone. They melted back into the pines, sated. The bloodclaws stared at the empty snow, breathing hard. Kyle rushed to the king. "Gideon!" Gideon was on his side in the snow. He was shifting back. The transformation, a painful, steaming process of bone and sinew. He was naked, his human form pale against the blood-stained snow. His cursed arm was bleeding, but so were a dozen other new wounds. The shadow claws had torn him open. He tried to push himself up, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. "My king," Kyle started, reaching for him. "The girl," Gideon gasped, his golden eyes finding Esme. He was looking at her, his gaze intense, pained. He collapsed. His head hit the snow, his body going limp. The only color in the vast white landscape was the spreading stain of the king's blood, dark and steaming on the ice. A profound animal terror seized Esme. The king was down. The warriors were in disarray. "He's dead?" whispered one of the younger bloodclaws, his voice breaking. "He is not," Kyle snarled, ripping off his own heavy fur cloak to cover Gideon's body. "The shadows. They take his stamina, not his life. But he's bleeding. Fast." Esme slid from her pony, her legs leaden. The rope on her hands was a simple knot. She fumbled with it, her fingers numb, finally worrying it free with her teeth. She fell to her knees in the snow, her mind racing. They were in the middle of nowhere. He was bleeding. He was cursed. "We need to make camp," Kyle ordered, lifting Gideon's arm over his shoulder. "Find a cave, an overhang. Anything, now." The warriors scattered, their movements frantic. Esme just stared at the blood, dark red but also from his arm, the sluggish oily black, poison and life mixing in the snow. "I know herbs." Her own voice from that morning echoed in her mind. "You!" Kyle barked at her, his face a mask of grief and fury. "Useless! Stay out of the way!" Esme ignored him. Her gaze was frantic, scanning the trees, pine, spruce, ice moss, but she needed more. She looked at the blood again. The poison was cold. The wounds were hot. She needed to draw the one and soothe the other. "There!" a warrior shouted. "A cleft! Under the ridge!" They half-dragged, half-carried Gideon's limp form to a shallow cave, barely more than a crack in the rock, but it was sheltered from the wind. They built a fire at the mouth with frantic, desperate speed. Kyle laid Gideon down near the flames. The king was pale, his breathing shallow. The shadow wounds were already starting to fester, a faint, dark steam rising from them. "He's burning," Kyle said, his voice raw. "The curse. It uses the wounds to enter." Esme pushed forward. Kyle put a hand on her chest, shoving her back. "I said, you need to clean the wounds," Esme said, her voice surprisingly steady. The cold had focused her. "With snow, and you need to boil water, now." Kale stared at her, shocked by her tone. "Do you want him to die?" she snapped. "Boil water, and bring me pine needles, the new growth, and bark from the underside of that willow we passed." The warrior looked at Kale, who, after a frozen moment, nodded. "Do it, and watch her." Esme didn't wait. She grabbed a small pack from her pony's saddle, her dowry, her mother's meager collection of herbs and tools which she'd been forced to carry. She pulled out a small stone mortar and pestle and a leather-bound book. She ran back into the snow, ignoring the warrior who followed her. She was a creature of the woods. She found what she needed. She scraped resin from a pine, gathering handfuls of the snow-covered needles. She found the gray-green ice moss, a potent cooling agent. Back in the cave, the warrior had a small pot of water boiling over a spear point. Esme crushed the needles in moss, adding a pinch of dried nightshade from her pack. She added a splash of the boiling water, creating a thick, pungent green-black paste. Gideon was thrashing now, a low groan in his chest. He was lost in a fever dream. "Hold him," Esme commanded. Kyle and another warrior pinned Gideon's shoulders. Esme approached. This was the moment. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She took the steaming, coarse-spun cloth, dipped it in the remaining boiled water, and pressed it to the first shadow wound on his torso. He roared, a raw, inhuman sound, and bucked, throwing the two warriors off him. His hand, clumsy with fever, shot out and grabbed her wrist. His golden eyes, slitted and wild, snapped open. They were pure, feral instinct. He was looking at her, but he was seeing a threat. His grip was iron. "Gideon!" Kyle shouted, trying to pin his arm. "No, wait!" Esme breathed. She stopped struggling. She looked directly into his fever-bright eyes. His grip was crushing, but she did not pull away. His skin was fire. "Gideon," she whispered. Her voice was soft, not a command, but a call. "You are Gideon Bloodclaw. You are not the shadow." His gaze wavered. The feral light dimmed, replaced by a flicker of pained confusion. He was still holding her, but the pressure eased. "It burns," he rasped, his voice a dry, cracked thing. "I know," she said, her voice impossibly gentle. "I am here to help. You have to let me." His gaze traced her face from her wide, frightened eyes to her pale, set mouth. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a burden, not as a tool, as her. He slowly released her wrist. His massive, scarred hand fell open onto the furs. It was an invitation, a surrender. Esme's heart was hammering so loud she was sure the whole cave could hear it. She took a deep breath. She dipped her bare fingers into the hot herbal paste. She knelt beside him. His skin was hot, his muscles tense. She placed her small, stained hand on the center of his chest, right over his heart. He flinched, but he did not pull away. Then, slowly, carefully, she began to apply the ointment to the shadow wounds, her touch light but firm. She was Esme Shadow Moon, and she was a healer. Gideon's eyes fluttered, and for a moment his gaze was lucid, his eyes clear and sharp. He was watching her save him. "Why?" he whispered, his voice raw. "Why didn't you run?" The fire crackled, the only sound besides Gideon's ragged breathing. Esme didn't answer him. She couldn't. Why hadn't she run? Where would she go? Back to Alaric, who would let her freeze? Back to the shadows that had just tried to devour her. She was trapped between a dying king and a dying world. She finished her work, her hands moving with a purpose she hadn't known she possessed. She spread the dark, resinous paste on the last of the wounds, then took the clean linen bandages Kale offered and began to wrap his torso, his arms, his legs. Her hands were clinical, detached, but her heart was a traitor. She was touching him. His skin was hot, the muscles of his abdomen coiling even in his weakened state. He was a landscape of strength and scars. She had been terrified of this body, of its power, and now her hands were all over it, mapping its geography of pain. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her body exhausted, her mind numb. Kale and the other warriors had created a perimeter at the cave mouth, their forms stark against the blue twilight snow. They were giving their king privacy. Gideon had not taken his eyes off her. His fever was still high, but the lucidity, the core of him, was back. "You have a healer's touch," he rasped. "My mother taught me," Esme whispered, finally looking at his face. He was pale beneath his weather-darkened skin, his lips cracked. "The shadow moons we were keepers of the old root knowledge." "Weak," he quoted, his voice thick with irony. "Alaric called you weak." "He only values what can be broken with a fist," Esme said, and the bitterness in her own voice surprised her. Gideon's gaze was heavy. He was a fool. He coughed, a dry, painful sound that shook his entire frame. He tried to sit up, but his muscles locked, and he fell back with a groan. "Don't move," Esme said, pushing gently against his good shoulder. "The poison, it's still in you." "It's always in me," he breathed, his eyes closing for a moment. "The Shadow Witch, she did not just curse my arm, she cursed my blood." He was confessing. She didn't know why. Perhaps the fever, perhaps the why she hadn't answered. "My line," he continued, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the cave roof. We are bound to the north, but the north, it has teeth. An old god, a thing of ice and shadow, was trapped beneath the iron keep by my ancestor. The witch, she woke it, or at least she opened a door to it. The curse is not her magic, it's its magic. It's a living, hungry cold. Esme listened, her blood running colder than the snow outside. It feeds on strength, Gideon whispered. The stronger I am, the faster it eats. It wants an alpha. It wants me. Esme looked at the black oily gash on his arm. It was not a wound. It was a leash. I am dying, Esme Shadowmoon, he said, the words simple, factual, and utterly devastating. I've been dying for a year. The mating ceremony. He let out a harsh, dry laugh. It was not a visit. It was a desperate final gamble. Esme's heart clenched. What do you mean? The old law magic, a true mate bond. It is the only thing strong enough to fight the curse, to share the burden, to have the poison. He turned his head on the furs, his golden, wolfish eyes pinning her. I came to Alaric's pack to find a mate, he said, his voice raw with a self-loathing that shocked her. To find any strong, healthy she-wolf and force a bond, to shackle her to my curse, to poison her, just to buy myself a few more years. Esme felt sick. This was the king? This desperate, broken man? But I couldn't, he whispered. I watched them, laughing, feasting, full of life. I couldn't be that monster. I couldn't choose one to doom. He looked away, back into the fire. The ceremony was ending. I had failed. And then I saw you. Esme stopped breathing. You were sitting alone, he said, his voice barely a breath. You were an outcast. You were in your own cage. You were already living a death sentence, just like me. The pieces clicked into place, sharp and painful. I didn't choose you to doom you, he said, his voice thick with a sudden terrible urgency. He reached for her, his hand grasping her arm. I chose you to save you. It was an impulse, a stupid, noble impulse from a man who cannot afford nobility. I thought I would take you, give you a place in my keep, and die alone as I was meant to. He was lying to himself. He was lying to her. You chose me because I was already broken, Esme said, the words tasting like metal. I was the one you could sentence because my life wasn't worth anything to anyone. No, he growled, and the force of it, the pure, unadulterated denial, made her jump. I chose you because I understood you. He was closer now, his breath hot on her face, his grip on her arm not painful, but inescapable. I was bound by my crown. You were bound by your pack. I acted. I claimed you under the law, a burden, my responsibility. He was panting, the exertion, the emotion, costing him. And now, he said, his eyes wild, now you have healed me. The paste, the herbs, the shadow wounds, they are cold. Esme touched his forehead. The raging fever was gone. His skin was still warm, but it was the warmth of life, not of fever. Her herbs, they worked. A slow, terrible dawn broke in his eyes. He looked at his bandaged arm, then at her. The curse, he whispered, his voice full of a new, dawning horror. It is quiet. For the first time in a year, it is quiet. He looked at her, and the raw fear in his eyes was not for himself. It was for her. You didn't just heal the wounds, did you? He raspy. You touched the curse, and it touched you back. He pulled his hand away from her as if she were the fire. You are not just a healer, he breathed, a terrible, profound realization passing over his face. You are the cure. And I've just dragged you into my grave. The words hung in the frozen air, heavy and toxic. I have just dragged you into my grave. Esme stared at him. He, Gideon Bloodclaw, the Alpha King, was afraid, not of the shadows, not of the curse, but of her, of what he had done to her. The curse, Esme said, her voice small but sharp. When you touched me, back in the hall, I felt it. A cold. It's a parasite, Gideon said, his voice grim. He sat up slowly, his muscles protesting. He was weak, but the fever was broken. Her paste had worked. It tethers to my spirit, my life force, and it pulls. It pulled at me, Esme whispered, remembering the creature's cold, shadowy hand. It will see you as part of me now, Gideon said, his voice flat with despair. Because you are. You healed me. You bound yourself to my fate. I never intended this. Esme looked at her own hands, stained green from the moss and black from the resin. They looked small, breakable, but they had stopped a king's fever. They had quieted a curse. Shadow Moon, Gideon had said. The name meant something. My pack, Alaric. They said my line was weak, Esme said, thinking aloud. My mother, she was a healer, but after she died, they burned her books. They said it was old world magic. They said it was dark. It's not dark, Gideon said, his golden gaze fixed on her. It's light. What I felt when you touched me, it wasn't just cooling. It was clean. Shadow Moon, Esme repeated, the name feeling strange and new on her tongue. My grandmother told me a story once, that we didn't just heal, that we fought the shadows, that our light was born from the moon to give comfort to the dark. She looked at him, her eyes wide, a new fragile idea forming. They weren't afraid my magic was weak, Gideon. They were afraid it was strong. He was a king, bound by a curse of shadow. She was a healer, born of a line of light. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a burden. It was destiny. A terrible, beautiful, and utterly terrifying destiny. We were two halves of a whole, she breathed, the realization striking her with the force of a physical blow. A king who couldn't be healed, and a healer who wasn't allowed to heal. Gideon just stared at her, his expression unreadable. He was a man of action, of swords and laws. This was the realm of fate, of magic. And he was lost. A howl split the night. It wasn't Kale. It wasn't one of the blood claws. It was a thin, shrieking, empty sound. They're back, Kale roared from the mouth of the cave. And there are more. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his sword. He was still weak. He swayed, and Esme's hand shot out to steady him, her fingers wrapping around his bare, muscle-corded arm. The contact was electric. A jolt of something, warmth from her, cold from him, passed between them. He looked at her, his eyes wide. He felt it. Ah, they smell the change, Gideon snarled, his voice a low growl. They smell the cure. They've come to stop it. My king, Kyle shouted. We can't hold them. They're solid. Gideon pushed Esme behind him. Stay in the cave. Do not come out. Like hell, Esme said. The voice was not her own. It was strong, clear, and absolutely furious. Gideon turned to look at her, his eyes wide with shock. Esme was glowing. It was not a firelight. It was a pale, silver-white aura, pulsing from her skin, making the shadows in the cave draw back. Her hands, in particular, were ablaze with a soft lunar light. They are made of shadow, Esme said, her voice ringing with an ancient borrowed power. And I am a shadow moon. She walked past him to the mouth of the cave. The clearing was a nightmare. A dozen of the shadow creatures were there, but as Kale had said, they were more. They had taken on forms. They looked like wolves now, twisted and skeletal, their forms made of roiling black smoke. They were snapping and tearing at the bloodclaws, who were fighting a losing battle. Esme, no! Gideon roared, lunging for her. Stay behind me, my king, Esme said, and the power in her voice stopped him cold. She stepped out of the cave onto the blood-stained snow. She raised her hands. The shadows stopped. They turned, as one, to look at this new, brilliant light. It hurt them. They hissed, a sound like 1,000 snakes. You took my mother, Esme whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden, terrible silence. You made my people forget. You made me forget. You will not have him. She slammed her hands down onto the snow. A shockwave of pure white light erupted from her, a perfect circle, expanding outwards. It was not a physical force. It was a wave of purity, of healing. When the light hit the shadow creatures, they didn't just burn. They evaporated. They screamed, their empty, thin sound rising in pitch, and then they were gone. Just gone. Dissolved into nothing but a memory of darkness. The clearing was silent. The bloodclaws, Kyle, Gideon, they were all staring, their weapons slack in their hands. Esme stood in the center of the clearing, her silver light fading, her small body trembling with the effort. The snow around her was untouched, pure white. She had just banished a dozen shadow demons with her hands. She turned, her legs feeling like water. She looked at Gideon. He was staring at her, his face a mask of profound, terrified awe. "I think," Esme said, her voice her own again, small and shaking, "I think your curse is linked to my bloodline." She took a shaky step and her knees buckled. Gideon was there before she hit the snow. He caught her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her against his chest. He was solid and warm, and he smelled of pine and iron. "Witch," he breathed, but it was not an accusation. It was a prayer. He held her as if she were the most precious, terrifying thing in the world. And in the sudden moonlit silence of the forest, Esme finally let herself lean against him. She was not his burden. He was not her cage. They were something else entirely. The silence held for a long, stunned moment. The Bloodclaws, hardened warriors who had faced down horrors Esme could not imagine, simply stared. Their axes were lowered. Their faces, lit by the fire and the rising moon, were filled with a reverence that was almost painful to see. Kyle was the first to move. He walked forward, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped a few feet from where Gideon held Esme. He didn't look at his king. He looked at her. He dropped to one knee, his fist over his heart. "My lady," he breathed, the word torn from him. One by one, the other warriors followed, a dozen of the deadliest men in the north kneeling in the snow. To her. Esme buried her face in Gideon's chest, her body trembling with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Make them stop," she mumbled. Gideon's arm tightened around her. His own body was thrumming with a strange, new energy. Where her skin touched his, he felt whole. The cold, parasitic drain of the curse was gone, replaced by the warm, steady hum of her. He looked over her head, at his men. His voice was raw, but the iron was back. "Get up, you're tracking snow." They rose, but the way they looked at her was forever changed. Gideon bent, his legs still shaking from weakness, and slid his arm under her knees. He lifted her. She weighed nothing, a bundle of wool and magic. He carried her back into the cave and set her down on the furs by the fire, as gently as if she were made of spun glass. He did not release her. He sat beside her, his back against the stone, his sword across his knees, and just watched her. Esme, huddled in his cloak, watched him back. The fear was gone. The terror, the humiliation, the cold transactions, they had all been burned away by that silver light. "The curse," he said, his voice low. "It's still there." Esme's head snapped up. "But it's asleep," he continued, touching the bandage on his arm. "It's quiet. It's not feeding. You've put it to sleep." "For how long?" Esme asked. "I don't know." He looked at her, his golden eyes searching her face. You are the moon to its shadow. It cannot feed while you are near." The implication of that settled on them. While you are near. He had claimed her to be a shield. He had thought her a burden. And she had become his anchor. She was the only thing keeping the ancient hungry god at bay. "This is not the life I would have chosen for you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Regret. To be shackled to me, to my darkness." Esme thought of the great hall, the whispers, the pity, the cold, lonely bench, the life she'd had. "You didn't shackle me, Gideon," she whispered, and it was the first time she had used his name. It felt right on her tongue. You set me free." He reached out, his hand massive and scarred. He hesitated, as if afraid to touch her. Then, his fingers gently, reverently, traced the line of her jaw. His thumb was rough, calloused, and impossibly warm. "Esme," he breathed. It was not a statement. It was a question, an answer, a beginning. He did not kiss her. It was not the time for that. This was something deeper, more profound. It was a true mating, not of flesh, but of fate, a bond forged in ice, fire, and shadow. He was the cursed king. She was the healer of the light. He leaned his forehead against hers. His breath was warm on her skin. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong against her own. It was a promise. They stayed like that for a long time, as the fire burned low and the moon, full and bright, climbed high above them, bathing the broken, purified snow in its pure silver light. Kyle stood watch at the mouth of the cave, his back to his king. He heard no words, but he felt the shift. The air in the cave was no longer cold with fear. It was warm, and it was whole. The curse was not broken. Not yet. The shadow god was still waiting, dreaming beneath the ice. But it was no longer unopposed. The king had found his queen. Epilogue. A year passed, marked by the turning of the snows. The Iron Keep was no longer a fortress of shadows. The great dark halls, once cold with Gideon's curse, were now filled with light and warmth. Herbs hung from the rafters, their scent, rosemary, thyme, and silver thistle, overpowering the old stone. Esme Shadow Moon, no, Esme Bloodclaw, was not the queen. She was the healer. The people of the north, who had long suffered under the creeping shadow of the mountain, came to her. She healed their aches, mended their hearts, and taught them the old root knowledge that had been stolen. Gideon stood on the battlements, his back to the setting sun. He was no longer the cursed king. He was just Gideon. He still wore the black leathers, but his face was no longer carved from stone. There was warmth in his eyes, laughter lines at their corners. He watched Esme in the courtyard below. She was teaching a group of children how to find the ice moss. She was covered in mud, her silver blonde hair a mess, and she was laughing. The sound carried up to him on the wind. The curse was still there. He felt it, a cold, sleeping serpent in his blood. But it was his now. He controlled it. Esme looked up as if she'd felt his gaze. She smiled, a brilliant, radiant thing that outshone the setting sun. He did not have to act like she was his. She was his. And he, in every way that mattered, was hers. He was not bound by the curse. She was not bound by the crown. They were bound by something stronger. He turned from the wall, his heavy cloak sweeping behind him, and went down to meet his wife. They were not two broken pieces, not anymore. They were a single, defiant fate, a love that had stared into the shadow and dared to shine back. The king of iron and the queen of light, walking hand in hand into the long, beautiful northern night. This story follows Esme and Gideon, two souls isolated by their respective curses, hers of social exile, his of ancient dark magic. Their journey begins not with love, but with a raw, desperate act of survival. It's a story about how the parts of ourselves we are taught to believe are weaknesses, Esme's useless healing, Gideon's monstrous burden, are, in fact, the very keys needed to unlock our shared destiny. By moving from fear to trust, and through the crucible of survival, they find that true strength isn't about crowns or curses, but about finding the one person who sees your shadow and chooses to bring their light.